The runway lights flickered and died, and in the sudden blackout, a thunderous roar split the night as a C-17's monstrous shadow bore down on David Monroe's tiny airstrip. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. The sky was a bruised purple, the last light of day fading behind a low bank of clouds. A cool breeze whispered over the tall grass lining the edges of a narrow runway, carrying the soft scent of damp earth and old engine oil. Crickets chirped with a steady rhythm, as if keeping time for the gentle swaying of the windsock atop the rusted control tower. In the distance, an old hangar leaned to one side, its weathered doors half open, revealing the shadow of a small single-engine plane resting inside like a faithful old dog. Shadows pooled where the tarmac met the unkempt field beyond. There was a hush to the air, a held breath that seemed to wait for something impossible and yet inevitable to happen. David Monroe stood at the threshold of that hangar, coat collar turned up against the chill. His boots pressed lightly into the rough asphalt, and he let his hands rest in his pockets, fingers brushing the worn leather of the envelope tucked inside. He had walked this length of runway every evening for the last week, as if by pacing he could bargain with fate itself. Tonight felt different. The air was too still, the quiet too complete. He inhaled deeply, tasting the promise of rain on the horizon, then exhaled, reminding himself that he had kept this airstrip alive against every odds stacked against him. The envelope weighed heavy in his pocket, its contents a foreclosure notice from the county courts. He had stared at those typed words in disbelief, 30 days to pay or lose everything. The letters blurred as he read them again, though nothing changed. This patch of land, this tarmac, these hangars, they were more than a farm airstrip. They were his story, his legacy. He needed the money to save it, to honor the promise he'd made so many years ago. But where would he find it? His fields had been stripped bare by drought, and his savings had been washed away in one bad season after another. He remembered the day he first saw that stretch of land, a younger man then, full of hope. He'd crawled out of the cab of his pickup truck, squinted against the sun, and felt some deep memory stir in his chest. His father had flown in the war, carrying him up in a tiny cockpit when David was still small enough to curl into his grandfather's arms. The farm and the runway were both gifts from that memory. He'd swept away the weeds, laid down new asphalt, built hangars with his own two hands. On clear days, he'd taxi his plane beside the fields, banking low over the corn to feel the rush of wind against his face. It was freedom cloaked in simple beauty. Now, the hangar doors creaked as the breeze shifted, and somewhere inside, an old wrench tumbled to the ground, clattering against the concrete floor. David's heart tightened. He moved forward, peering into the gloom, but saw only the dim outline of the Piper Cub he'd used to teach his granddaughter, Sarah, how to handle the yoke. She'd laughed the first time the wheels left the earth, her small hands steady on the controls. She believed in this place as much as he did. He could almost hear her voice, bright and full of wonder. "Grandpa, promise me we'll never let it die." He had promised her then, and he would keep that promise or die trying. He stepped back into the open, the cool air wrapping around him like a cloak. Beyond the lights of the farmhouse, he heard the low murmur of electricity, the faint hum of a distant tractor parked for the night. The world out there was shifting, new airports, bigger airlines, government inspectors with clipboards and stern faces. Last week, a county official had driven out on the gravel road, boots crunching, and handed him that envelope. The man's eyes were cold, seeing a loser and a burden. David had nodded respectfully, even managed a weak smile, but inside he felt the chill settle deep in his bones. He closed his eyes and pictured the stretch of sky above the runway. It had been his sanctuary, a place where the horizon never ended. He remembered the smell of aviation fuel mixed with wildflowers, the rich scent of summer nights echoing with engine hum. At dawn, he would walk out again, but tonight he paused, the tension coiling inside him like a spring ready to snap. He thought of Sarah preparing for her own flight lessons at the tiny flight school in the next county. Without this airstrip, she would have to travel hours just to take to the sky. The thought pricked him with guilt, and he pressed his palm to his chest as though to quiet the ache. A lone star appeared overhead, peeking through a gap in the clouds. It blinked unwavering, and David stared until it drifted behind the veil of evening mist. There was something about that small point of light, a reminder that even in darkness there was guidance. He straightened his shoulders. Tomorrow he will fight back. He would call old friends in the aviation club, see if they could host an emergency fair, raise funds, anything to buy him time. He would not let a stack of paper decide the fate of this place he built from hope and hard work. Not while his heart still beats. A distant rumble cut through the quiet, low and powerful, like a sleeping giant stirring from slumber. David froze, breath caught in his throat. He scanned the horizon where the runway met the trees, eyes straining for shape in the gathering gloom. The rumble grew, more insistent now, carrying itself on the wind. His heart knocked against his ribs as he realized it was no tractor at rest but the thunder of engines, far too loud, far too big for any small plane. He took a step forward, boots crunching on loose gravel, and sensed the ground vibrate beneath his weight. In the brief glow of a lightning fork high in the sky, he saw it, the silhouette of an aircraft far larger than anything he had ever guided down this strip. Its shape was impossible, wings too broad, body too massive to alight on these narrow fields. Panic and wonder warred in his chest. For a moment he thought he dreamed it until the rumble became a roar, and a bright headlight split the darkness, racing toward him. The impossible landing was coming now, and with it, a night that would change everything. The roar came without warning, ripping through the hush of the night like a living thing. David's heart pounded as the giant metal bird bore down the length of his runway, its landing lights carving bright scars across the tarmac. The wind off the propellers whipped up dust and dead leaves, swirling in chaotic eddies that danced at the edges of his vision. He lurched forward, coattails snapping, as a thunderclap of engines and screeching brakes echoed against the distant tree line. The C-17's wheels bit into the asphalt with a violence that rattled his bones. Bright sparks sprayed off the undercarriage before, against all reason, the massive aircraft finally ground to a halt 100 feet from him, engines still whining in protest. He stood rooted to the spot, breath coming in ragged bursts, until a flood of adrenaline snapped him back to action. Grabbing the flashlight from his belt, he swept its beam over the hulking airframe. Olive drab and too large for his little strip, it looked lost here, its cargo doors yawning open like a cavernous maw. Thick exhaust smoke curled skyward, mixing with the low mist that had begun to settle, blotting out the stars. Every instinct screamed that this was impossible, yet there it rested, wings spanning wider than his hangar's doors. "Hello." His voice cracked as he called into the twilight. No answer came, only the hiss of cooling metal and the distant hoot of an owl. He hesitated, every fiber of caution warning him to stand back, then jogged forward, boots crunching on loose stones. He should have run for help, but the thought of leaving this place unguarded felt like betrayal. Whoever came to land here had chosen him, the choice was no longer his. He reached the ramp and paused, flashlight trained on a line of uniformed figures stepping down the ramp in silence. They moved with the precision of soldiers, faces obscured by night vision goggles and helmets. A man in dress uniform, silver braid looping around his shoulders and polished boots, waited at the bottom step. He seemed to carry the hush of authority in his posture, as if the world bent around him. David swallowed. "I'm Colonel Richard Porter," the officer said, voice low but carrying. He didn't bother with introductions beyond rank. "We're here on urgent business. You'll need to secure the site and keep it clear. Understand?" He extended a gloved hand, palm down, as if sealing a contract. David glanced at the flashlight's beam, flickering over Porter's stern jaw and the glint of steel on his belt. I, I don't know what you mean, David managed. This strip? It's my property, but I'm under foreclosure. I can't. Porter's gaze flicked beyond him to the hangar and back. We have no quarrel with you personally, Mr. Monroe, but we need this field. Now, there's no time for paperwork. He nodded sharply to a younger officer who stepped forward with a folder and pressed it into David's grasp. The top sheet was stamped Top Secret in bold red letters. He felt a prickle at the base of his neck as he read the header, Operation Iron Wing Emergency Deployment. David's jaw tightened. I can't sign off on something I don't understand. Then watch your strip get snapped up by someone who will. Porter said, voice soft but chilling. Welcome to the end of the line, Mr. Monroe. He swept a hand toward the open cargo hold. Move it. A knot formed in David's gut. He looked back at the file, the official seal heavy in his hand. Inside the shadows of the ramp, he heard muffled voices, arguing, soldiers unloading crates stamped with foreign words, thick straps swinging as they landed with heavy thuds. He realized they brought supplies, something valuable, something dangerous. He noticed a crate marked with a medical cross, another sealed in black plastic. He should have balked, called the sheriff, but the colonel's gaze held him in place, cold and unyielding, like the barrel of a gun. He stepped aside as the soldiers started moving equipment toward the hangar. The beam of his flashlight caught on Gus Jackson's face, a pale silhouette emerging from behind a crate, his longtime farmhand. David's heart jolted. Gus had stayed late that night, promising to help with the paperwork, but David had sent him home after the letter arrived. Gus's eyes flicked to David, then away. There was something unreadable in that glance. Gus, David said sharply, what are you doing here? He shut off the flashlight and squared his shoulders. You didn't tell me you were working with these men. Gus's face tightened, guilt and fear crossing his features in quick succession. I'm sorry, sir. They said it was your order to bring these crates in. They paid me to guide them. I thought. David felt the world spin. Paid to guide them? His own hand had signed no orders. He took a step back, the hammering of his heart loud in his ears. Betrayal cut deeper than any foreclosure notice. He turned to face Porter, who watched from the ramp with an almost amused expression. They lied to you, David said, voice shaking but firm. You were used. His gaze dropped to the colonel. You tricked me. Porter's lip quirked. We did what we had to do. Now get your lights on, run a comm check, activate the perimeter cameras. We'll need full visibility. David inhaled, fighting the urge to yell. He couldn't risk the lives of those soldiers or his granddaughter's future. He forced himself to nod. Fine, he said. He flicked on the lights along the runway's edge. The glow washed over the trees in weak yellow bulbs. Faces of soldiers flickered in the hangar door, outlines half hidden by crates and mist. He activated the old radio tower. Static crackled, then a crisp voice said, This is Iron Wing Control. Status. David swallowed around the lump in his throat. Runway secure, lights operational. Good, replied the voice. Begin offloading. He watched as box after box cleared the hold. His own strip had become a staging ground, a pawn in some covert maneuver. He thought of Sarah's laughter, her promise of skyward freedom, and his chest tightened. This was not what he'd fought for. This was not the legacy he'd imagined. Through a gap in the crates, he glimpsed a man in civilian clothes who'd pulled low, arms bound behind him. They dragged him out, and David's breath caught. The man's eyes were wide with fear, searching for help. Even here, one guard struck him in the ribs and he crumpled. The soldiers ignored his protest. The man in civilian clothes lay quivering on the tarmac. A knot of dread formed in David's stomach. He realized this wasn't just about supplies. Someone important was being moved under cover of night through a place of trust. His trust, and he had been tricked into aiding them. He stepped forward, voice echoing in the empty stretch between hangar and forest. Who is he? What's going on? Porter's shadow fell across the bound man. That's not your concern. You're here to keep things quiet. He tapped his ear. Command, the Monroe Field liaison is awake. Understood, came the reply, "Keep Monroe compliant. Extraction in 30. David's hands clenched at his sides. 30 minutes. In that time, they'd load the crates, take the prisoner, and leave him with a bill and an empty field. He thought of the foreclosure, notice burning a hole in his coat pocket, the betrayal by his own hand, the thought of Sarah forced to chase a dream hours away. His vision blurred with anger. "Not on my land," he said, voice low and controlled. "You leave now or I shut this down." Porter's laugh was quiet but cold. "You think you can stop a C-17 with your old tractors? Or an army with your two-man radio? Mr. Monroe, you have no leverage here. This strip is as good as gone." David stared at the colonel, then turned back to the bound man. The stranger's eyes found him, raw with panic and desperation. David felt a spark of empathy he hadn't known he still had. He stepped over the crates, knelt beside the stranger, and gently laid a gloved hand on his shoulder. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "I'm going to get you out of this, but I need your help." The man's eyes flickered with a glimmer of hope. "Name's Michael Hart," the stranger rasped. Porter's going to move me to a hostile zone. If they find out I talked." David clenched his jaw. He thought of Sarah's voice, her plea for hope against hopeless odds. He looked up at Porter, then back at Michael. Betrayal had come in many forms tonight. Legal papers, a hired hand's duplicity, a government colonel's orders. But David Monroe still had one advantage. This land, this runway, was his by blood and sweat. If he could shut down those lights, cut off that radio, maybe he could stall them long enough. He rose, voice steady. "No one's moving anywhere until I say so." He flicked off the runway lights. Darkness swallowed the strip. He smashed the radio with the heel of his boot. Static crackled once, then died. Soldiers shouted. The hum of engines faltered. For a moment, the night returned. Only wind, only dust, only the pulse of possibility. Rain began to fall in fine sheets, cool droplets sizzling on hot metal. David stood in the center of the strip, soaked and unbowed. Above him, thunder muttered in the clouds. He had ignited the spark that would change everything. Betrayal had arrived at his doorstep, but he would answer back with defiance. The real conflict was only beginning, and he would fight it on his terms. David walked between the broken runway lights and the smoking C-17, his coat heavy with rain, heart heavy with questions. Every step echoed in the hush that followed his sabotage, and each echo carried a weight. What had he unleashed? Beside him, Michael Hart, still bound at the wrists, sat shivering on a crate. David knelt and pressed a hand to Michael's shoulder. "I need you to tell me everything," David said, voice low. "Why did they bring you here and what do they want?" Michael's eyes were bloodshot, but something flickered there, defiance, even hope. "I'm an analyst with the UN," he whispered. "I discovered evidence that weapons in those crates would be used to commit war crimes. Porter's command is to ship them straight to a conflict zone. I tried to leak it, so they branded me a traitor." David absorbed Michael's words, gaze drifting to the dark hangar. Gus Jackson emerged, dripping wet, carrying a toolbox as though nothing had happened. His face was tight, guilt and fear battling for space. David met his eyes. "Why did you help them?" David's tone was more hurt than angry. Gus set down the toolbox and ran a hand through his damp hair. "I'm sorry, Mr. Monroe. I needed the money. My boys' hospital bills, they were piling up. They said you'd signed off on it. I thought I was helping you." David's chest tightened. The betrayal stung, but a deeper ache formed for Gus's desperation. He remembered the day he'd hired the old farmhand. Gus had saved him when his fence collapsed in a storm, with no questions asked. Could he blame a man who had nowhere else to turn? "Your son's sick," David said quietly. "You didn't have a choice." Gus lowered his head. "I know, but I never meant for this. I didn't know who they really were." A flash of lightning illuminated Colonel Richard Porter standing at the ramp's mouth, arms folded. His eyes bored into them all, cold and calculating. Beneath that calm surface, David sensed a man who saw people as chess pieces. Porter's voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Monroe, you've made things difficult. If you continue to obstruct, we'll be forced to take more direct measures. David rose, fists clenched. This is my land. You cannot threaten me. Porter stepped forward, wet boots crunching on gravel. Your land's under seizure, Monroe. The notice is filed. Soon it won't matter what you say. David's heart lurched. The foreclosure notice, he'd assumed it was a bluff, but now he saw its role in this covert operation. Porter had engineered not only Michael's capture, but David's own ruin. Every choice he had felt he'd made freely was in fact orchestrated by the colonel. He looked at Michael, then to Gus, then back at Porter. His voice was steadier than he felt. You leave, you'll take your crates, and you'll leave Michael here with me. If you try otherwise, I'll call every neighbor, every pilot I know. This airstrip may be small, but my community is large. Michael's gaze sharpened. They won't stop at threats, he said. Porter answers to people with more power than you can imagine. Porter's lips curved into a thin smile. Good luck. He turned on his heel, signaled silently, and the soldiers backed away into the hangar. In moments, the massive door sealed them in darkness. David stood alone on the wet tarmac, rain pelting his face, wind whipping around him like a wild thing. He watched the last soldiers vanish, then walked back to Michael. He knelt again, pried apart the nylon bindings, and freed his wrists. Michael flexed his arms as though awakening from a nightmare. Thank you, Michael said, voice hoarse. I owe you my life. David offered a small nod, though he didn't feel like a hero. I can't let you die for telling the truth, he answered. Inside the hangar, lights clicked on. David and Michael stepped over scattered crates. Gus hovered by the toolbox. The air smelled of wet metal and fear. Michael scanned the stack supplies. These crates hold chemical agents, he said softly. They're not for medical use. If shipped, they'll kill thousands. Gus staggered back. I didn't know, his voice broke. David placed a hand on Guy's shoulder. None of us did. But now we do. He turned to Michael. What can we do? Michael's gaze followed the heavy chains securing the crates. We could disable the planes. The engines. They won't last long without repairs. David felt his pulse quicken. It was dangerous, illegal, even, but so was letting those weapons leave. I can strip spark plugs from the old crop duster, he said. It'll stall any big plane trying to take off. Gus's eyes widened. We'll get caught. Porter will come back. David squared his shoulders. Let him. I'll hold him off. Michael touched David's arm. You need help. I can reach out, send a distress signal. Make sure the world knows what Porter's planning. David glanced at the battered radio in the corner, wires spliced and torn. It's dead. I smashed it. He shook his head. I didn't want them to use it. Michael exhaled slowly. We'll rig something. They moved together, an odd trio held by purpose. Michael found wires and circuitry. David fetched tools. Gus retrieved parts from the old Piper Cub. Rain continued to drum on the hangar roof. As they worked, David's mind wandered to Sarah. He imagined her sunlit laughter, the way her eyes lit up when she flew. He had promised her this airstrip would be hers one day. He had made that promise to his granddaughter, and he would keep it even if it meant standing alone against an army. Michael's voice brought him back. We have a basic transmitter. It'll send a short burst, but it should reach someone listening. David nodded. Good. Do it now. Michael bent over the radio, hands steady despite exhaustion. Sparks flew as he rewired circuits. Gus hovered, fear and hope warring in his eyes. David watched them both, the rain-muted world outside, the crates that carried death, and the man he'd never met until hours ago, risking everything for truth. A piercing siren cut through the night. The hangar door creaked as metal scraped against metal. David stepped forward, eyes narrowing. Porter's voice thundered from the darkness. This is your last chance. Open the hangar and walk out. Otherwise, we're coming in. David took a steady breath. He felt the weight of every choice he had ever made, for his father, his farm, his granddaughter. None of it mattered if he let those crates leave. His gaze swept to Michael and Gus. We're ready, he said into the night. In the next heartbeat, the door began to rise, and David raised his voice. Colonel Porter, he called, I want to talk terms. The siren died. Silence returned, broken only by the steady hum of the rain. And for the first time, David Monroe felt the full measure of his resolve. He would not back down. Not now. Not ever. Rain pelted the tin roof of the hangar in relentless sheets as David crouched beside Michael, watching the newly rewired transmitter flicker to life. Each spark of circuitry felt like a heartbeat, pulsing hope into the stale air. Rainwater pooled around their boots, cool and crawling, but neither man noticed. They were caught in the web of their own making, wiring lies and betrayal into a device meant to be their salvation. Gus hovered nearby, shoulders stooped, face drawn tight with guilt. David glanced at him, the farmhand who had stood by his side through storms and drought. The betrayal of the night before had stung, but he'd forgiven Gus. His son's life had been at stake. David convinced himself the old man only helped Porter under duress. He still believed in loyalty born of years. Michael tightened a final screw and straightened. "It's ready," he said, voice hoarse. "We can send a burst now, just enough to reach the regional FAA and whoever listens on the UN frequency." He patted the device. "They'll know Porter's moving chemical weapons. They'll intervene." David nodded, relief flooding him. "Do it." Michael hesitated. "Wait, what about our escape? We need to disable the runway lights and engines. Are you sure you can stall at C-17? He glanced at Gus. Gus managed a faint nod. "Between you and me, I know these planes. I can make sure nothing flies out tonight." David let pent-up tension ebb away. "Good. We'll hit them from both sides, communication and mobility. Porter will have to back down." Michael activated the transmitter. A soft hum rose, then crackled as static resolved into a clear tone. David pressed the handheld microphone to his lips. "This is the Monroe Field emergency. Colonel Porter is shipping chemical weapons under Operation Iron Wing. Require immediate intervention, security breach in progress. Coordinates follow." Each word felt like a confession, but he spoke anyway, voice steady despite pounding heart. He recited the GPS coordinates embedded in Michael's folder. The static flared, then faded. Michael cut power. "That's it. The message is out." David exhaled, shoulders slumping. "Now we wait." A tense silence fell, broken only by the rain and distant thunder. Michael wiped sweat and rain from his brow. Gus shuffled, uneasy. David realized they'd let their guard down, forgetting the urgency of the moment. He stood and stretched his back. "Let's move those parts to the Piper Cub," David said. "Once the power's off, we can drop its spark plugs there. No one will suspect a thing." Gus nodded and turned, grabbing a toolbox. Michael slung the transmitter over his shoulder. Together, they headed deeper into the hangar, past looming crates and coil of cables. That's when David heard it, a soft click, too deliberate for rain. He froze. Somewhere behind him, a hatch door must have opened. He whirled, shining his flashlight toward the rear wall. Gus and Michael stopped in mid-step. "What was that?" David whispered. Michael lowered his makeshift satchel. "I didn't hear anything." Gus pressed a hand to his ear, frowning. Sounded like metal on metal. His voice trembled. David's instincts flared. He edged backward, lightsaber-steady grip on his flashlight. The hangar seemed to shrink as shadows lengthened. He scanned between the crates. Nothing, but the click came again, closer. Suddenly, light flooded in from the hangar entrance. Not the weak yellow bulbs David had reactivated, but harsh white floodlights, too bright. He squinted, trying to make out shapes. 3 figures strode in, rifles trained on him. Down on the ground, a voice barked Gus's voice. "Gus!" David croaked. "What are you?" Gus's aim wavered, guilt flickering. Then he snapped it back into place. "Don't make me do this, David." His finger tightened on the trigger guard. David's mind reeled. Betrayal cut sharper than any blade. He sank to his knees, hands spread on the metal floor. "Why, Gus? Why?" Gus's lower lip trembled. "You forced me to choose, Dad." The word stung like acid, Dad. David blinked, certain he misheard. "Gus, you're no son of mine," he gasped. Gus's eyes glistened. He glanced at Porter's flank, stepping through the gloom with Colonel Porter's polished stride. He is. The rifle wavered. I am. David's head spun. He remembered hiring Gus a decade ago, a shy, solemn man who'd tended the crops. He never knew Gus had a son until... But that revelation wasn't enough. He looked from Gus to Porter. Porter halted 10 feet away, arms crossed, gaze amused. He stepped forward. Quite the family reunion, isn't it? He gestured at Gus. Didn't tell you he was my nephew? Porter's lips curved. Families helped me a great deal. Blood pounded in David's ears. All this time, Gus's loyalty had been to Porter's family, not his own boss. Gus had feigned helplessness over his sick boy, but the truth was more tangled. Porter's voice slithered into the shadowy hangar. Gus has been invaluable guiding shipments, ensuring you stayed compliant. He raised a hand, and 2 soldiers moved forward to secure Michael. Michael tried to struggle, but a rifle knocked him back. David's hands flexed on the cold floor. You used him, he rasped at Porter. Used is such a crude term, Porter replied smoothly. We helped each other. He gained financial support for his son's treatment. You gained a night's worth of hope before realizing it was misplaced. David's chest tightened with rage and heartbreak. Gus's head bowed, eyes fixed on the crate-strewn floor. David crawled forward on his knees, closing the distance. Gus, he whispered, we trusted you. His voice cracked. I trusted you. Gus looked up, tears mingling with rain on his cheeks. I did what I had to do, he said. My son. He might not have lived without it. Porter's people paid for every treatment. He saved my boy. David's mind spun. Porter had orchestrated the foreclosure, drawn David in, used Gus to disarm him, and hidden Michael's fate until now. Everything David did, every sabotage, every wire, had played into Porter's game, moving the chemical weapons on schedule, unimpeded. Porter clapped once sharply. Mr. Monroe, no hard feelings. We'll wrap up tonight. Thank you for your cooperation. He signaled. The soldiers began hauling crates back to the C-17. David fought rising panic and desperation. He thought of Sarah's face, her trust, her dreams. He could not let Porter win. He risked a glance at Michael, weak but alive. Even shackled, Michael's eyes burned with defiance. David swallowed and forced his voice steady. You think you've won, he called to Porter, but you don't know everything. He flicked a nod at Michael. The imprisoned man's gaze sharpened. Michael strained against his bonds with a sudden, fierce energy. A soldier stepped forward to strike him. David dropped forward, grabbing the soldier's ankle as he passed. The man yelped and stumbled. Another soldier raised his weapon, Gus's rifle. Gus hesitated, lowering it an inch. That split second was all David needed. He yanked free and dived toward Michael, knocking the guard aside. The rifle went off, the shot deafening in close quarters. Metal door panels rattled. Chaos erupted. David lunged at the binding that held Michael's wrists and tore through the rope. Michael sprang up, a limp protest turned to action. They rose together as Porter barked orders. Secure Monroe. Protect the crates. But in that angry swell of noise, the hangar door began to roll down, its heavy slats clanking, obscuring the floodlights. David kicked at the control box, yanking wires free. Sparks flew. The crate of chemical agents grew dim in the wavering light. Then the power died. Darkness swallowed the hangar. Rain flooded in cold and blinding. Soldiers shouted in confusion, rifles clicking. David grabbed Michael's hand and pulled him deeper between crates. Gus dropped to his knees, bowed head, the weight of remorse crushing him. David ignored him. There were bigger battles to fight. He pressed Michael up against a stack of crates. We need to move those C-17 engines, David hissed. Can you help me? Michael nodded, voice shaking. Where are the keys? David pointed. Pilot's console over there. He sprinted, feet slipping on wet concrete, heart hammering. In seconds, he was yanking at a panel on a portable generator. He remembered Gus's promise. They'd strip the spark plugs. Porter's shouts cut through the darkness. Find them. Move those crates out now. Soldiers fanned out, aiming flashlights and weapons. David worked faster, whispering instructions to Michael. Unscrew the panel, yank the harness. We'll kill the engines. A bright beam flooded near him. He dove aside as a soldier fired a shot. The bullet pinged off metal above his head. He fought panic, forced himself to focus. His fingers found the harness. He yanked, sending a tangle of wires free. A generator groaned and died. White lights winked out one by one. Only the feeble storm lanterns strapped to crates glowed. The hangar plunged into near black. Panic rippled through enemy ranks. Gunshots cracked. Soldiers yelled orders in the dark. David seized Michael's arm. "Now," he whispered. They bolted toward the crates marked with oil drums, flames of lanterns guiding their path. They reached the first engine housing. David grabbed glow sticks from his pocket, snapped one, and jammed it under the housing. Michael fitted a coil of wire. They had it jury-rigged enough for one good spark. A muffled explosion echoed under the metal. Metal groaned, oil hissed, wet sparks flew. The engine housing flared briefly, then stilled. The lamps on the tarmac winked out as generators died. David and Michael dashed deeper into the shadow, every step a risk. Above the storm, thunder rumbled. Rain hammered the hangar, turning the tarmac to glass. David steadied himself, coughing on the scent of burning oil. "We need to get out," he rasped. Michael pointed. "Emergency exit through that door." They skidded toward a narrow crawl space behind the main structure. A soldier's flashlight caught them. David grabbed Michael and dove through just as the door slammed shut behind them. They tumbled into a muddy ditch outside. Wet, exhausted, and half-blinded by rain, they pressed against the hangar's side, hearts pounding. Through a slit between corrugated metal sheets, they saw Porter storm out, face furious as he barked orders. Soldiers fanned out into the storm, searching. David exhaled, hope flickering. They had stalled Porter's plan, but at terrible cost. Gus's betrayal had cut deeper than any rain-soaked wound. He lifted Michael's arm in a silent promise. They'd fight back, find allies, and expose Porter's war crimes. And maybe, just maybe, they could still save the airstrip for Sarah. He turned to Michael, dripping and muddy. "Let's go," he said. "We've got work to do." Together, soaked to the bone, they vanished into the night, shadows reclaiming the man who had once lit them, forging their own path through thunder and betrayal. Rain pounded the fields beyond the hangar, turning ruts in the dirt road to mud that clung like wet cloth to David Monroe's boots. He kept one arm around Michael Hart and the other on Gus Jackson's shoulder as they stumbled toward the tree line, each step a struggle against the wind and their own exhaustion. The roar of C-17 engines faded behind them, replaced by the echo of distant shouts and the crack of thunder overhead. David's mind raced. They had crippled Porter's operation for the night, but at what cost? The rain blurred his vision, and every shadow looked like a soldier lying in wait. Michael's arm pressed against his side felt damp and weak from the binds. Gus lagged behind, shoulders bowed under the weight of guilt and something else. Fear. They reached a small copse of pines, needles dripping, and David guided them into its shelter. Twigs cracked underfoot, and he hissed for them to keep silent. The wind gusted through the branches, carrying the scent of pine and wet soil. David closed his eyes and listened. No engines, no voices, only thunder and rain. He turned to Michael. "Are you hurt?" Michael shook his head, teeth chattering. "Just bruised ribs. I'll live." "Good," David said. "We need to move before dawn. Porter will send search teams." Gus sank to a fallen log, head bowed. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I never meant." David cut him off gently. "Save it for later. Right now, we need to this is our lifeline." Gus groaned. "What about my boy? I have to get back soon. They'll ask why I didn't follow orders." David's jaw tightened. "We'll find a way to help him. But right now, we fight." He looked into Gus's eyes. "I need you with me for Sarah's sake, for your son's sake." Gus nodded, wiping rain from his face. "I'm with you, sir." David exhaled. He hated that life or death had forced them together in this betrayal and rebellion. He thought of Sarah, safe at her mother's house miles away, unaware of the danger swirling around her grandfather's airstrip. He had promised her he'd never let it die. Now he would go to war to keep that promise. They set off again, following a narrow path through the woods that led toward the nearest county road. David checked his watch. 2:15 a.m. dawn was still hours away, but the rain would stop soon. He hoped. As they walked, Michael stumbled. David caught him. Steady, he murmured, "What now?" Michael's face was pale, but determined. "We need to reach Sheriff Linda Reynolds. She's an old friend. If Porter's men try to raid my contacts at the UN office, they'll knock on her door." He sniffed. "She won't betray me." David considered. Sheriff Reynolds had once taught Sarah to ride horses. He'd trusted her with family gatherings. But he remembered the sheriff's cautious smile. She valued the law and might hesitate to break it for a fugitive. Still, desperate times called for desperate measures. They reached the road, and David signaled for Gus to watch their backs. A single lantern swung in the distance at the sheriff's house. David led them across the muddy ditch and up the gravel driveway. The porch light shone like a beacon of hope. Michael wiped his nose on his sleeve and rapped on the door. David steadied him. After what felt like an eternity, the door swung open to reveal Sheriff Reynolds in a rain-spotted coat, revolver holstered at her side. "David?" she exclaimed, eyes widening to see him wet and filthy. "And Michael? What on earth?" Before David could answer, two more figures slipped in behind them, a state trooper and a man in plain clothes. Michael's eyes widened. "They've been following me," he hissed. Reynolds's face hardened. "Inside now." She stepped aside and ushered them in. David thanked her and closed the door against the storm. The trooper's booted feet came next. The plainclothes man's gaze flickered from Michael to Gus. Inside, the parlor smelled of pine cleaner and old leather. A fire crackled in the hearth, though the warmth did little to dry their soaked clothes. Reynolds gestured for them to sit on a worn leather sofa. David pulled the thumb drive from his pocket and placed it on the low coffee table. "We need your help, Linda," he said. "Porter's shipping chemical weapons under cover of night. Michael has proof. This drive, these documents." Reynolds frowned, leaning forward. "Chemical weapons? Michael, is this true?" Michael swallowed the lump in his throat. "They're using the crates to ship sarin gas. I discovered it. Porter captured me to stop me." He held up his bruised ribs. "He's ruthless." The state trooper stepped closer. "You're under arrest, Hart. You've committed espionage against the United States." David leapt up. "What? You can't." The trooper held up a laminated badge. "FBI. Michael Hart, you're in custody." He reached for Michael's arm. Michael glared at Reynolds, his eyes pleading. "You knew they might come for me, Linda. You promised to protect my contacts." Reynolds looked torn, duty against friendship. David saw the conflict in her eyes. He swallowed. "Linda, if Porter moves those crates, thousands could die. We need that data public. We need your badge and authority." Reynolds closed her eyes, a single tear tracing down her cheek. "I'm sorry." She turned to the trooper. "Let him go." The trooper shook his head. "Without a warrant, all I have is a national security hold." He motioned to the plainclothes agent. The man advanced on Michael. David's heart hammered. He stood, fists clenched. "This is bullshit. He's telling the truth. We sent a transmission. You have to listen." Reynolds raised a hand. "Not here. They'll leak to the press and compromise everything." She turned to the agent. "Transport him to the station. I'll get a warrant." Michael's face went pale. "You're betraying me." "No," Reynolds said softly. "I'm following the law, and I'll do what I can to help you, but I can't break my oath without proper cause." David felt fury surge through him. "You were our hope." He turned to Gus. "We can't count on anyone." Gus stood, voice trembling. "There has to be another way. The old radio tower, maybe we can boost the signal. Or the neighboring farmers." David shook his head. "Not enough time. Porter will move at first light." Reynolds laid a hand on David's arm. "David, Susan called. Sarah's mother's worried sick. They haven't heard from you." Her gaze softened. "You said you'd fight for her dream, but you're risking your life." David's throat tightened. He pressed a hand to his chest. "Sarah believes in this airstrip. It's her path to freedom. His voice cracked. If it dies, she'll lose more than the runway. Reynolds looked at Michael's bruised face, then at David. Finally, she nodded. All right, I'll authorize you to leave with Hart under my supervision. We'll file the warrant tonight, and I'll alert federal authorities in D.C. about the chemical shipments. She reached into her coat and pulled out a faded business card. Call this number at 5 a.m. It's for Special Agent Morales in the FBI Counterproliferation Division. Mention me. David exhaled a shaky breath and glanced at Michael, whose hope flickered again. Thank you, Michael whispered. Reynolds turned to the trooper. Return the drive and documents. Release Hart. The trooper hesitated, then compiled. He handed Michael the folder. Michael thumbed through the papers, relief and fear mingling in his eyes. Reynolds held up her hand. One more thing, Porter has moles in the county administration. They approve that foreclosure sale. Your strip is still at risk. She looked at David. You need proof of your ownership before morning, or someone else will take it. David nodded. He had exactly 12 hours. He would have to break into the county clerk's office if necessary. His heart pounded at the thought. Breaking the law to uphold the law. The wind rattled the windows. Rain dripped from the gutter outside. David realized he was running out of choices and time. He rose, voice firm. Okay, we move at first light. Michael and I will head to the county seat. Gus, you stay here with Linda and watch Sarah's card. He picked up the card. We'll call Morales at 5. He turned to Gus. Take care of the radio tower. Maybe you can boost the frequency so more people hear Michael's warning. He looked at Reynolds. Thank you, Linda, for everything. Reynolds gave a small, sad smile. Be careful. She handed Michael a thermos of coffee. Stay warm. As David, Michael, and Gus stepped back out into the storm, David felt the weight of every decision pressing on him. He had allies, but fragile ones. He had a plan, but a reckless one. He had a daughter, a granddaughter, whose dreams depended on his success. Above him, clouds churned like angry giants. And somewhere in the storm, Colonel Porter plotted his next move. David trudged through the mud, heart heavy yet determined. The night had tested him more than any drought or foreclosure notice ever had. But he still had a choice to stand and fight or to surrender everything he held dear. He tightened his grip on Michael's arm and set his jaw. Dawn would bring the next battle, and he would be ready. David blinked against the first glimmer of dawn. The sky, a pale wash of pink and gold above the fields. The storm had passed, leaving the air fresh and sharp with the promise of a new day. He stood beside Michael at the edge of the county clerk's office parking lot, dew beating on his coat, and turning his breath to mist. In his hand, he clutched the wet, mud-smudged deed to Monroe Field, the proof that Porter's foreclosure papers were nothing but a lie. Michael's eyes shone with cautious hope. You got it, he whispered. David nodded, voice low. We have to hurry. Porter's men will be here soon. They crept toward the battered sedan Michael had borrowed, its engine already idling. Gus waited behind the wheel, his forehead furrowed with exhaustion and guilt. Sheriff Reynolds pulled up behind them in her cruiser. Her face was pale but determined. I'm calling Morales now, she said. You two go. I'll stall Porter's agents at the office. David placed a firm hand on her shoulder. Thank you, Linda. Be safe. She offered a small, sad smile. Get him safe. Michael slid into the front seat, and David climbed in beside him. Gus burned rubber as he pulled onto the road, red tail lights disappearing into the morning haze. David leaned forward. What now? Michael tapped the thumb drive. He'll confirm the evidence and bring federal agents to intercept Porter. David exhaled. Then we head back. I need to secure the airstrip, make sure no one else can grab it. Gus's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. I'll help. Anything for Sarah's future. David's chest tightened. Sarah's laughter, her wide-eyed wonder when she first flew, gave him the strength to keep going. Thank you, he said simply. At Monroe Field, the morning light revealed the scars of the previous night, broken lights, twisted metal, the heavy tracks of C-17 tires pressed into the tarmac. David's heart clenched at the sight. He jumped from the sedan before it came to a full stop, Michael at his heels. They moved toward the hangar, where Gus had already started up the backup generator. "You want me to light the runway?" Gus called over the engine's growl. David shook his head. "No lights. We need to keep it dark. Porter won't risk a landing once he knows we're ready." He laid a hand on Michael's arm. "Are you sure Morales will come?" Michael glanced at his watch. He said 60 minutes. "It's almost time." David signaled Gus to join him under the hangar's dripping eaves. As they huddled, the distant thrum of a jet engine rumbled through the valley. David's pulse quickened. He pressed himself flat against the corrugated steel, feeling the cold rain, water trickle down his back. A spotlight swept the empty runway, carving a bright arc across the darkness. Footsteps crunched on gravel behind him. David tensed as Colonel Porter emerged from the blur of rain and light, his uniform damp and stained, face tight with anger. Two of his soldiers flanked him, rifles held at the ready. "Morning, Monroe," Porter said, voice low and deadly calm. "I see you still haven't learned your place." David swallowed. "This airstrip belongs to me. Your claim is invalid." Porter smirked. "Legally, perhaps, but morally, you'll step aside." He lifted his hand, and the spotlight swung toward the hangar. "Or you can watch me take off." David's stomach twisted. He thought of Sarah, waiting for the day she'd pilot a plane from this very strip. He thought of the people Michael hoped to protect. "Not today," he said. Michael stepped forward, voice raised. "Porter, you know what you're shipping. You won't get away with it." Porter's eyes narrowed. "Hart, you're a traitor." He barked orders in a language David didn't recognize. His men leveled weapons. David raised his hands. "Wait." A distant roar filled the sky. The unmistakable drone of transport, two Black Hawk helicopters descending through the dawn mist. Porter's soldiers scattered for cover, weapons raised in the sky. David's heart hammered. He exchanged a glance with Michael. The helicopters swept low, rotor wash tearing mud from the fields, and touched down beside the hangar. Federal agents poured out, badges glaring in the weak sun. Special Agent Morales strode forward, pistol drawn, voice booming. "FBI, Colonel Richard Porter, hands where we can see them." Porter's smirk faltered. He raised his arms slowly. "So you found out." Morales cuffed him, reading him his rights as agents secured the crates and disarmed the soldiers. David felt a wave of relief, so intense it nearly buckled his knees. Michael rested a steady hand on his shoulder. "You did it," Michael whispered. David exhaled, voice raw. "You did it." Morales approached, eyes serious but respectful. He took the thumb drive from David and nodded to an agent. "Get this to forensics. Confirm chemical signatures and chain of custody." He turned to David. "You've done a service. We'll need your statements." David wiped rain from his eyes. "Just make sure it counts." Morales glanced at the crates, then back. "It will." By midday, the airstrip buzzed with activity. Federal agents cataloging evidence, local deputies photographing the scene, and news helicopters hovering overhead. David stood beside Sheriff Reynolds as she watched a deputy post a property secured notice on the foreclosure sign, tearing it down. Reynolds nodded. "Your ownership's clear now." David's chest tightened with gratitude. "Thank you for everything." She glanced toward the road. "Your granddaughter's coming." At that moment, a bright blue SUV rounded the far corner of the runway road. Sarah Monroe tumbled out, arms lifted in a shout of triumph. She raced across the apron toward David, eyes shining. He knelt, sweeping her into his arms. "Grandpa," she cried. He held her close, voice catching. "Hey, kiddo." She looked around, curiosity piqued by the helicopters and agents. "What happened?" David ruffled her hair. "Something dangerous. But now it's over." Sarah frowned. "Dangerous?" He smiled, tears in his eyes. "Sometimes doing the right thing is risky, but you have to stand up anyway." Sarah's brow furrowed, then softened as she hugged him tighter. "I'm proud of you." As the sun climbed high, the agents loaded the last of Porter's crates onto secure trucks. Michael Hart, free but exhausted, stood beside David. "What will you do now?" he asked quietly. David glanced at the runway, the golden fields beyond, and up at the open sky. Sarah waved from a road. "I'll rebuild this place," he said. "Better than ever." He slid the deed from his coat and held it out to Michael. "And you, come teach here. You owe me a few lessons after last night." Michael smiled, a real, full smile. "You're on." Gus emerged from behind a fuel truck, face lined with relief. He approached David. "My boy's getting care," he said softly. "Thanks to this, I can pay the bills." David clasped his shoulder. "Take care of him, Gus." Gus's eyes glistened. "I will, sir. I will." David watched as Sarah disappeared inside the hangar, her voice already rising in excited chatter. He turned back to see Linda Reynolds talking with Morales, their conversation serious but relieved. He breathed in the morning air, fresh, clean, and full of possibility. He felt the weight of the past night lift from his shoulders, replaced by a quiet certainty. He had fought for truth, for justice, and for the promise he made to a little girl with big dreams. In the warm light of the new day, he realized that legacies were not just land or runways, but the choices we make when the stakes are highest. As he walked toward his granddaughter, hand extended, he knew that the future, uncertain and wide as the sky, was theirs to shape together. And that was the greatest victory of all. The morning sun warmed the runway, turning the asphalt a soft gray gold. David Monroe stood beside the hangar door, watching federal agents and local deputies finish their work. Crates marked with red, biohazard, labels were sealed into secure trucks, and officers moved with precise care. The storm scars had been erased, broken lights replaced, oil stains scrubbed, the heavy tracks of the C-17 erased by fresh gravel. Even the muddy ruts had been filled in. David's chest lifted with relief, but his heart still carried the weight of what had happened here. He ran a hand along the hangar's cool metal siding, feeling the curve of the corrugated steel beneath his palm. In that simple touch, he sensed every choice he had made, the lies he had told, the laws he had bent, the risks he had taken, and he wondered if the cost had been too high. Sheriff Linda Reynolds walked up behind him, her tall boots crunching on the fine gravel. She handed him a stack of papers, the signed warrant voiding the foreclosure, the official transfer of deed back to his name, and a letter of commendation from the state attorney general. "You did good, David," she said quietly. "You saved more than a strip of land." He glanced at the documents, scanning the legal language made plain. "Monroe Field, free and clear, recognize your rightful ownership, commend your courage." He folded the papers carefully and tucked them into his coat. "Thank you, Linda," he said. "Without you, it would still belong to Porter's cronies." She shook her head. "You did this. I just gave you the tools." She offered him a small, genuine smile that warmed him more than the sun. Nearby, Michael Hart stood wrapped in a blanket, sipping hot coffee from a paper cup. His face was pale but calm, the bruises around his ribs fading to purple shadows. Special Agent Morales joined him, placing a steady hand on Michael's shoulder. "Your evidence checks out," Morales said. "We've traced the supply chain, and Porter's network is dismantled. You helped stop a war crime." Michael's eyes glistened, and he sighed, exhaling the tension of the past days. "I couldn't have done it without David," he said, voice husky. "He trusted me, even when it meant going against every rule he'd ever known." David approached, and Michael held out his hand. "Thank you," he repeated. When David shook his hand, he felt the quiet force of a bond forged in fire and fear. He realized that standing up to power had given him a new purpose beyond his little airstrip. Gus Jackson walked out of the hangar, his boots still stained with mud. He carried a small cardboard box tied with twine. The county hospital had waived fees once the state attorney general's office intervened, thanks to the evidence Michael had sent. Gus's eyes filled with tears as he held the box to his chest. David caught his arm. "Gus," he said gently, "your boy will be all right." Gus blinked away tears, voice thick. "I never imagined something good could come from that night," he whispered. "I betrayed you, but you saved me too." David placed a hand on Guy's shoulder. "We all make choices we regret. What matters is what we do next." Gus nodded, wiping his eyes. I'm staying on, sir. This place, Sarah's future, means everything to me now more than ever. Sarah Monroe came running across the apron, her little backpack bouncing. She stopped at the hangar's edge, eyes wide at the scene, deputies, agents, and her grandfather standing tall beneath the morning sun. "Grandpa!" she cried, her voice bright. David knelt and lifted her into his arms. She sniffed the clean air, then frowned. "What happened here?" she asked, voice small. He hugged her close. "Something scary," he said softly, "but now it's over." He spun her around to point at Michael, standing with Morales. "This is Michael. He kept the world safe." Sarah's brow furrowed. Then she grinned. "I want to learn from him." David laughed, hugging her tighter. "You will, and you'll learn from me, too." She buried her face in his chest and whispered, "I love you, Grandpa." His throat tightened. "I love you more, kiddo." He realized that every risk had been for moments like this, safe smiles, hopeful futures, a little girl's faith in her grandfather's promise. Later, as the last agents drove away, David walked out onto the runway alone. The tarmac gleamed in the mid-morning light, promising new beginnings. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, tasting the sharp tang of fresh gravel mixed with the faint scent of jet fuel from Michael's C-17. Memories of the past nights, darkness, rain, betrayal, threatened to unbalance him. He thought of Porter's cold calm, of Gus's trembling guilt, of Michael's desperate courage. He thought of every time he had cheated the law to protect the innocent. Was it right, he wondered, to break one rule to uphold a greater truth? Had he become judge and jury, ministering justice on his own terms? His heart answered with a steady beat. Yes, because the law alone could not guard every soul. Sometimes a single man's choices, born of compassion, must fill the gaps left by cold statutes. David knelt and ran his hand along the painted numbers at the runway's edge, 1, 2, 3, 4. Those simple digits marked the strip's orientation, and to him they symbolized the compass rose of his life's work. He had built this field from broken dreams and stubborn hope. Tonight, he had defended it with every ounce of his being. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the thumb drive Michael had used and the soak papers bearing Porter's false claims. He held them up against the sky, then dropped them into a storm drain grate. He turned the valve cover and watched them vanish beneath the metal bars, confident no one could ever use them to harm again. Justice, he knew, was not about vengeance, but about ensuring the weak could stand as tall as the strong. He rose and walked back to the hangar, where Sarah waited with Michael and Gus. Michael held a small toy airplane, a vintage Piper Cub model Sarah had won in a raffle to raise funds for the strip's repairs. He handed it to her, and she opened her palms to catch the tiny wings. Her eyes sparkled as she ran it along her arms. "This will be my first plane," she said. David smiled, tears pricking. "It will be," he promised. He turned to Michael. "When she's ready, you'll teach her." Michael nodded, voice soft. "I'll teach her how to tell the truth, too." As they walked toward the farmhouse, David felt the weight of the morning's decisions release from his shoulders, replaced by a quiet resolve. He had faced darkness and emerged with more than victory. He had gained clarity. He understood that moral courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. He thought of the people who had helped him. A granddaughter's faith, a sheriff's courage, a friend's sacrifice. Their trust had ignited his own. Under the wide, clear sky, he knew the future would hold new challenges. Storms yet to come, choices that would test his heart. But he also knew he would face them as he always had. With steady hands, an open heart, and the unshakable belief that some things, like hope, like truth, like love, were worth risking everything to protect. And with that thought guiding him, he stepped forward, ready to build tomorrow from the hard-won lessons of yesterday. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.